Poisoned skies, the first gas attack of the Great War. The spring of 1915 brought a silence that unsettled veterans along the Western Front. For days, French and British troops near Ypres had noticed strange movements across the German lines, rows of large metal cylinders being buried into the earth, hoses snaking toward the parapets. The men joked about new beer barrels or water tanks, yet officers were uneasy. Something about the deliberate way the Germans handled those containers felt wrong. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp as wet pennies. It was a chill wind that evening of April 22nd, and as the sun dipped over the flattened villages of Flanders, few realized they were about to witness the birth of a new form of terror in warfare. From the very beginning of the Great War, both sides had sought any advantage to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire had already made the Western Front a graveyard of strategies. But in the laboratories of Germany, scientists such as Fritz Haber believed that chemistry could succeed where tactics had failed. He was convinced that by harnessing industrial gases, warfare could be accelerated, victory achieved through science rather than attrition. It was an idea that fused patriotism with cold calculation. Under his supervision, the German army's pioneer regiments began experimenting with chlorine, a substance so common in industry that no one suspected it could become a weapon of mass death. At Ypres, the conditions were perfect for testing. The front lines curved in a shallow bulge, the Ypres salient, where French, Algerian, and Canadian troops held positions opposite the German Fourth Army. The terrain was low and damp, the trenches flooded with brown water, and a steady westerly wind often swept across the fields toward the Allied lines. In late April, when the wind direction finally stabilized, German commanders gave the order. Engineers opened the valves at 5 CPM. A deep hissing spread along nearly 6 kilometers of front, like a monstrous sigh rising from the ground. Within moments, a pale green cloud began to form, rolling slowly, hugging the soil as it advanced toward the unsuspecting French positions. At first, soldiers simply watched in confusion. Some thought it was smoke from a new kind of shelling. Others assumed it was camouflage for an infantry assault. But as the gas drifted closer, the sweet, suffocating stench filled their nostrils. Then came the screams. The chlorine reacted with moisture in the lungs, forming acid that stripped away tissue and filled airways with fluid. Men clawed at their throats, coughing up foam and blood, eyes burning, blind with agony. Horses collapsed beside wagons, their bodies writhing. Within minutes, the French line disintegrated. Survivors fled, stumbling through the fields as the green fog consumed the trenches behind them. This was the first time in history that an entire army had unleashed a chemical weapon on a battlefield. The devastation stunned even its creators. German officers, unprepared for the scale of the collapse, hesitated to advance. Thousands of French colonial troops lay dead or dying, and a gap 4 miles wide opened in the Allied front. Yet the German infantry waited for reinforcements that never came, allowing Canadian divisions nearby to rush in and plug the breach. In the chaos, soldiers improvised crude defenses, urinating on cloths and pressing them to their faces to neutralize the gas's effects. It was a desperate, primitive act of survival amid a horror no one had imagined possible. Throughout that night, the battlefield of Ypres became a vision from hell. The wind shifted and swirled, carrying remnants of chlorine through both sides of the front. Clouds drifted into shell holes where wounded men had crawled for shelter, filling the depressions like poisonous ponds. Lanterns glowed faintly through the haze as stretcher bearers moved among the dying, their bandages soaked with blood and mucus. Officers shouted orders no one could hear over the coughing and choking. The dead lay with their hands clutching at their throats, their skin tinted green and black. When dawn broke, the sun illuminated a landscape unlike any the world had seen. Trenches turned into morgues, the soil itself breathing poison. Reports from the front confused Allied headquarters. Some officers dismissed early messages as exaggerations. Others suspected a new type of smokescreen. Only when the survivors began arriving, faces blistered, uniforms soaked in vomit and tears, did the truth emerge. Doctors in the rear tried to treat men who were literally drowning from the inside. The chlorine burned mucous membranes, corroded the lungs, and caused chemical pneumonia that no morphine could ease. In field hospitals, the air was filled with gasps, the wet rasp of dying lungs, and the stench of acid. Nurses worked without protection, their eyes red from fumes that still clung to the patient's clothes. It was the beginning of a new, merciless chapter in medicine and war. The world press soon erupted with outrage. Headlines condemned Germany for poisoning civilization, while Berlin defended its experiment as a legitimate military innovation. To German propagandists, chlorine gas was no different from shrapnel. It was science doing its duty for the fatherland. Fritz Haber himself, now celebrated by the Kaiser, argued that it would shorten the war and save lives in the long run. His wife, Clara, a scientist as well, saw it differently. She was horrified by what her husband had done, and only days after Ypres, she took her own life with his service pistol. That tragedy mirrored the moral collapse spreading through Europe, where human ingenuity had been twisted into a weapon of annihilation. Back at the front, the Allies scrambled for countermeasures. Gas masks were hurriedly designed, first with cotton pads soaked in urine or bicarbonate, then with crude respirators made from gauze and charcoal. Soldiers learned to recognize the warning signs of a chemical attack: the low hiss of cylinders, the strange green glow at sunset, the taste of metal in the mouth. Yet chlorine was only the beginning. Once the barrier of morality had been broken, escalation became inevitable. Within months, both sides developed deadlier compounds: phosgene, diphosgene, and eventually mustard gas, each more efficient at inflicting terror. The Western Front became not just a line of trenches, but a laboratory of death, where every new horror demanded an equal or greater reply. The second gas attack at Ypres came only days later, this time directed against the Canadian lines. They had watched the French collapse and knew what was coming, yet preparation offered little comfort. When the green mist began creeping once again across no man's land, soldiers scrambled for rags and handkerchiefs, soaking them in muddy water or urine. Some buried their faces in the sleeves of their tunics. Others held their breath until their lungs burned. Machine guns coughed from the trenches as men fired blindly into the fog, not at enemies they could see, but at the creeping edge of an invisible killer. Within minutes, the line disintegrated into chaos. The air itself seemed alive, breathing death into every shell hole. Despite the horror, the Canadians held. In an act of grim courage, small groups counterattacked to stop the German advance. Their gas-blurred eyes watered, and their lungs bled, but they refused to abandon the field. One officer described the scene as a living graveyard, where the living and dead shared the same air. Horses bolted, artillery crews collapsed over their guns, and officers barked hoarse orders that dissolved into coughing fits. By nightfall, the ground around Ypres was littered with masks, rifles, and bodies locked in positions of agony. Chlorine had turned men into statues, hands clawing their faces, mouths frozen in silent screams. Yet somehow, the front line did not break. The courage of those who stayed kept the Allies from disaster. News of Ypres traveled quickly through Europe. Soldiers in every army began to fear the wind more than bullets. Commanders added meteorology to their daily reports, and gas alarms became as vital as artillery schedules. Civilians back home could scarcely believe it. Poison as a weapon of war sounded medieval, barbaric, against every convention of honor. But the industrial world had entered an era where honor and invention no longer aligned. In Germany, chemists refined the process, producing canisters capable of flooding entire valleys. Britain responded with its own chemical units, turning science into a mirror of vengeance. Laboratories that once made fertilizer or medicine now brewed death for the trenches. For the men on the ground, gas became an everyday terror. They learned to sleep with masks beside their rifles, to wake at the faintest hiss, and to trust that the next breath might be their last. Even when no attack came, the fear alone was enough to drive some mad. Gas didn't only kill, it haunted. The smell of chlorine clung to everything, from uniforms to canteen water, a constant reminder that the air itself could betray them. Letters from soldiers described a world where death had become a mist, silent and impartial. The Western Front no longer just consumed bodies, it devoured the very act of breathing. By the summer of 1915, gas warfare had spread across the front like a contagion of ideas. What began as a single German experiment at Ypres evolved into a permanent feature of the Great War. Each nation rushed to build its own chemical arsenal, convinced that to abstain was to surrender. The British introduced their first chlorine shells during the Battle of Loos that September, hoping to repay Germany in kind. But the wind betrayed them. As the shells burst, the toxic cloud drifted backward, enveloping their own troops. Men collapsed in heaps, coughing and choking, while the enemy watched in disbelief. The irony was cruel. Science had made them victims of their own invention. The lesson was simple. Poison did not recognize flags. Still, production intensified. Factories once dedicated to textiles and paint now mixed death in secret vats. Chemists measured success not by innovation, but by lethality. Phosgene, far deadlier than chlorine, arrived that winter. Unlike its predecessor, it was almost invisible and smelled faintly of hay. Soldiers might not notice its presence until hours later, when their lungs filled with fluid and they drowned in their own blood. Mustard gas came next, a weapon that didn't just kill, but disfigured. It blistered skin, melted eyes, and contaminated the ground so completely that trenches became uninhabitable for days. It was war turned into slow corrosion, a battlefield where pain replaced honor as the measure of endurance. Doctors struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Field medics wrapped the dying in wet cloths and prayed for rain to wash the gas away. Ambulance convoys moved through landscapes that looked biblical, fields scorched yellow, corpses swollen and stained. In hospitals, surgeons encountered wounds they couldn't classify. Lungs blackened, eyes clouded, skin peeling in sheets. Each patient became an experiment in survival. The only solace was routine. Morphine for pain, oxygen for the few who could still breathe. For many, there was nothing to do but wait for death's slow, tightening grip. Gas masks improved, but morale did not. Soldiers joked grimly that the masks made them look like monsters, which felt fitting in a war that had already made them so. In time, gas lost its shock value. By 1916, it was simply another instrument in the orchestra of destruction, used to soften trenches before an assault, to cover retreats, or to deny the enemy ground. But no amount of normalization erased the dread. Gas hung over the war like a curse, visible or not. Soldiers whispered about it at night, scanning the horizon for strange fogs, testing the wind with trembling fingers. When they dreamed of suffocation. Some said they could still smell chlorine even when none was present. It lingered in the soul, a ghost of chemistry, a reminder that humankind had poisoned its own sky in pursuit of victory. By 1917, gas had become both weapon and warning, a symbol of how far modern warfare had strayed from any trace of restraint. The British perfected their own gas units under the newly formed Royal Engineers, while the Germans advanced to complex mixtures that blended chlorine and phosgene for longer, deadlier effects. Artillery replaced cylinders, allowing shells to deliver gas regardless of wind. The battlefield transformed into a chemical storm, shells that didn't explode with shrapnel, but with invisible death. In places like Ypres and Passchendaele, the air thickened with the sickly sweet scent of phosgene, and rain mixed with toxins to create puddles that blistered skin. Even survivors who escaped the initial attack found themselves coughing for weeks, lungs permanently scarred. For the generals, gas remained a strategic experiment, an equation of wind speed, shell density, and timing. For the soldiers, it was a betrayal by nature itself. The once life-giving breath had become their greatest enemy. In diary entries, men described praying for storms, for any wind that might disperse the haze. Others begged to be reassigned, claiming that gas had made them cowards of the air. In truth, it made cowards of everyone. Even hardened veterans of Verdun and the Somme admitted that they feared gas more than bullets or artillery. A bullet could be dodged or forgiven. Gas struck silently, seeped into every corner, and punished courage as cruelly as cowardice. At home, newspapers still printed stories of heroism, but censors avoided describing the true horrors of chemical warfare. Families of gassed soldiers received vague reports of respiratory injuries. When the men returned, many were unrecognizable, faces scarred, voices rasping like dry leaves. Children stared. Wives wept. In Britain and France, anti-gas propaganda posters showed civilians wearing masks, warning that even the homeland might one day need protection. A strange new fear entered the public imagination. The possibility that war could reach not just the battlefield, but the very air people breathed. It was the moment when modern anxiety about invisible threats was born, long before anyone had heard words like fallout or biological weapons. The irony was that despite its terror, gas rarely decided battles. It disrupted, disoriented, and destroyed morale, but seldom achieved decisive victories. At Ypres, Loos, or Verdun, ground gained under gas clouds was soon lost again in mud and counterfire. In the cold arithmetic of war, gas was efficient in killing, but inefficient in conquest. Yet it persisted, partly because it frightened, and fear itself became a weapon. Commanders learned that panic could paralyze armies faster than bullets. Every hiss of leaking air, every strange smell on the wind could make an entire division mask up and halt an attack. In that sense, the gas achieved its goal. It made every soldier breathe like a hunted animal. By the time 1918 arrived, the Western Front had become a graveyard of chemical experiments. The Germans introduced yellow cross shells packed with mustard gas, which lingered for days in the soil and on uniforms. Even the rain couldn't wash it away. Men who touched contaminated equipment hours after an attack found their skin erupting in blisters. The gas crept into dugouts and shell holes, punishing those who sought shelter. It didn't just suffocate, it maimed. Soldiers emerged from trenches blind and burned, their bodies covered in sores that oozed through the bandages. Mustard gas turned the very earth toxic, transforming battlefields into living wounds. Doctors began calling the survivors the walking ghosts, because many would never fully heal again. Among the Allies, scientists retaliated with equal ferocity. French and British chemists developed counter-gases designed to match German formulas in both range and cruelty. The Americans, arriving late to the war, brought industrial precision to production, building entire facilities for chemical shell manufacturing. Gas became the most technical arm of the war, a fusion of laboratory and battlefield. Each new compound demanded new masks, new filters, and new drills. Soldiers practiced donning respirators in under 6 seconds, their lives depending on speed. Commanders began timing their attacks, not by sunrise but by barometer, studying humidity charts as carefully as troop reports. The weather had become a tactical ally, or an enemy. The skies themselves were now part of the arsenal. At Ypres, once again, now in its final incarnation as the third battle, gas drifted so thick that even pigeons dropped from the air. Communication lines failed because messengers collapsed before reaching command posts. Units advanced blind, stumbling through the haze toward unseen targets. A single shell could contaminate an acre of ground. When gas mixed with the mud, it formed a slime that burned through clothing. Medics had to strip the wounded before treating them, risking exposure themselves. Entire divisions reported more casualties from gas than from bullets. The stench of chlorine and mustard hung over the fields for weeks, settling into the soil and rivers. Locals would later say, the land never smelled clean again. The human cost extended far beyond the trenches. Tens of thousands of soldiers returned home scarred for life. Their lungs never recovered, their eyes permanently damaged. Many were deemed unfit for work and lived out their days in coughing fits that echoed the war's cruel legacy. Children were told their fathers had caught gas, as if it were a sickness rather than an invention. Governments downplayed the long-term effects, yet the truth seeped out through hospitals filled with men who could no longer climb a staircase without collapsing. The Great War had ended with treaties and parades, but in the lungs of its veterans, it carried on, invisible and incurable. When the armistice finally silenced the guns in November 1918, the poisoned skies of Europe began to clear, but their legacy lingered. Fields once rich with wheat and poppies had become laboratories of decay. In Flanders and along the Somme, the soil still exhaled chemical ghosts after rainstorms, releasing faint odors of chlorine that made farmers cough decades later. The trenches had been filled, but beneath the surface lay unexploded shells, corroded canisters, and pockets of deadly gas, sealed by mud. French villagers spoke of animals dying mysteriously, of crops refusing to grow, of men collapsing without warning. The earth itself had absorbed the war's sickness, turning agriculture into a cautious act of faith. In some places, they simply built memorials instead of plows. The survivors of the gas attacks carried that sickness inside them. Veterans' hospitals overflowed with men whose lungs rattled like broken machinery. Some coughed blood every winter. Others wore masks long after peace returned. In Paris and London, pension boards debated whether gas damage counted as a war wound or an industrial condition. Many soldiers died years later, their deaths quietly folded into statistics rather than remembrance. The poets of the lost generation tried to explain what words could not. Wilfred Owen's Dulce et decorum est described one soldier failing to fit his mask in time, floundering like a man in fire or lime. The poem captured the helpless horror of breathing death, of watching comrades drown in air. For readers, it was the first real glimpse of what modern warfare had become. Nations vowed never to use gas again. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol outlawed chemical weapons, a belated attempt to reclaim humanity from its own brilliance. Yet the same scientists who had once brewed chlorine now studied nerve agents in secret, convinced that deterrence required readiness. War had changed the moral compass of science itself. The line between progress and atrocity blurred beyond recognition. Fritz Haber, whose discovery had made Ypres possible, lived long enough to see his fame rot into infamy. He died in exile, ostracized by both victors and vanquished, a man undone by the very chemistry he had loved. His name would later resurface in darker times, linked to other gases and other camps, proving that ideas once unleashed are rarely buried. In the decades after the war, the memory of gas became both legend and warning. Soldiers who had lived through it never forgot the feeling of drowning while awake. Even during the Second World War, when bombs fell daily and entire cities burned, commanders hesitated to deploy chemical weapons again. The fear of retaliation and the haunting lessons of Ypres held them back. Gas had become a taboo, proof that humanity, once it crossed a line, could still recoil in disgust. But the technology never disappeared. Stockpiles sat in warehouses and arsenals, hidden behind bureaucratic euphemisms, waiting for some future wind. The world had outlawed gas, but it had not forgotten how to make it. In Ypres today, visitors walk through reconstructed trenches and quiet cemeteries, where the grass grows bright green over poisoned ground. The Menin Gate echoes every evening with the sound of a bugle, calling the names of the lost. Beneath the memorials, the soil still hides remnants of the Great War's cruelest invention, shells that ooze chemicals after each frost, their contents as deadly now as they were in 1915. Farmers call them the iron harvest, and every year they turn up dozens more while plowing. It is a grim reminder that the past never truly sleeps, only waits beneath the surface. For those who study that first gas attack, the image of April 22, 1915, remains unforgettable. The wind whispering across Flanders, the green mist rising from the German lines, the sudden chorus of coughing, the panic of men realizing the air had turned against them. It marked the moment humanity crossed an invisible threshold, when intellect created something it could not morally control. The Great War promised glory, progress, and victory. What it delivered was a poisoned sky and a generation that learned too late that science without conscience is merely another form of destruction. In the years immediately following the war, Ypres became a place of pilgrimage and unease. Villagers returned to shattered homes, rebuilt walls around fields still marked by the ghostly green tint of chlorine, and learned to live with danger buried beneath their feet. Children played among rusted helmets and rotting barbed wire, unaware that some shells still carried the invisible residue of death. Farmers ploughing after rain wore scarves over their mouths, coughing at the faint scent of bleach that rose from the soil. Entire sections of land were declared unfit for cultivation, the infamous Zone Rouge. It was an open-air graveyard for both men and machines, where the earth refused to heal. Every spring, the frost pushed new relics of that day to the surface, as if the land itself remembered. In Germany, the veterans of the gas regiments received little honor. The world had condemned the use of poison as barbaric, and many who had operated the cylinders felt quietly ashamed. Some defended their actions, arguing that gas had been born of desperation, a weapon meant to end suffering quickly. But others could not forget the faces of the dying or the sound of lungs tearing apart. Among scientists, a darker guilt took root. They had proven that intellect could amplify cruelty, that progress could become perverse. When later generations asked how civilized Europe could have descended into mechanized slaughter, the chemists of 1915 offered the most chilling answer: because it was possible. In the classrooms of military academies, gas warfare became a case study in innovation without morality. In one lecture, a British instructor described the first attack at Ypres as an experiment that worked too well. Students listened in silence, aware that behind those words lay the deaths of thousands. The same lesson would echo through the 20th century. Technology obeys no conscience. When scientists later split the atom or designed missiles, they remembered the green clouds of Flanders. The line between defense and annihilation had been drawn there, in a field once filled with poppies, now overgrown with rusted metal and memory. For the men who had survived, the war's end brought no peace. They gathered in veterans' hospitals, their lungs scarred, their eyes pale and sightless. Every winter, cold air triggered their old injuries, sending them into violent coughing fits. Their families spoke in whispers about gas men, those who still smelled faintly of chemicals long after discharge. Some wore medals on tattered uniforms, but the glint of metal could not mask the ruin beneath. Their breath carried the ghost of Ypres, and when they exhaled, it was as if the war breathed through them. These were the men who had seen the sky turn against life and lived to remember. Decades later, historians would call Ypres a turning point, the death of 19th century warfare and the birth of industrialized horror. The gas cloud that rolled across Flanders in 1915 was more than a weapon. It was a revelation. It proved that human ingenuity could outpace human morality. Before Ypres, war had been fought by men against men. After Ypres, it became a contest of industries and intellects, of scientists competing to make suffering more efficient. The victims of the first gas attack were not merely soldiers. They were witnesses to the moment when the modern world lost its innocence. Today, the cemeteries of Belgium stand in quiet testimony. White headstones line the fields like teeth beneath the grass. The names carved into them tell the same story. Unknown soldiers, unknown regiments, unknown endings. Visitors walk among them with masks of their own, polite silence hiding disbelief. In museums nearby, the relics of gas warfare sit behind glass. Cylinders, masks, and shells labeled with Latin names that once meant progress. Guides remind visitors that on April 22, 1915, at 5 in the afternoon, humanity first discovered how to kill with the air itself. Outside, the wind still moves gently across the fields, indifferent, eternal, and clean again. But every year, when the poppies bloom and the mist settles low, locals say they can still smell something faintly metallic in the morning dew. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is memory, rising once more from the poisoned ground. The world has long since promised never to repeat that act, yet the lesson remains fragile. The gas of Ypres taught humanity that knowledge is power, and power, once released, never truly fades. The poisoned skies cleared, the war ended, and peace returned, but the air has never felt quite the same.